just a little bit while people hop on here. If you're watching, tell us where you're watching from. Hi, Tammy. Hi, Rebecca.
Northern California. I have a feeling it's probably, you've got better weather than we have in Kansas today.
Yeah. All right, everyone. We have some special guests with us today. We have Dr. Mitch Blanding and Rick Pope from Zoetis, and they are going to talk about spring calf health.
So be sure to get your comments in. Let us know what your questions you have to get answered by the experts. And we are going to be picking 3 $50 gift card winners at the end of this segment. So we'll go ahead and get started. So Dr. Blanding, to kick things off, why don't you tell us a little bit about what vaccines cattle producers should be thinking about using on their calves this spring, and take us through the whys of that.
Yes, Corey, first of all, thank you to you and Melanie for the opportunity. It's great to be with everyone today, and I guess good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're at. For those in California, I guess it's good morning still. But so it's a good question, and I mean, certainly when we start thinking about springtime, and if we consider that the majority of beef calves born in the U.S. are born sometime during spring, obviously there's some that are born throughout the year and some that are specifically born in the fall, but the majority of herds try to stick to some sort of a springtime calving schedule and a breeding schedule to focus on springtime calves. But the live calf is a culmination of a lot of efforts to, number one, get the cow bred, maintain and protect that pregnancy through the duration of gestation, and then doing everything that we can to help that cow or calf have a successful delivery. Depending on where you're at, that may require more effort than for some other folks. But the next thing that we have to do, and this is something that we kind of take for granted on the beef cattle side of the equation, is ensure that that calf gets the adequate colostrum that it needs. And we sort of make an assumption in the beef business. We see a calf nursing that we assume that it's getting all the colostrum it needs, and that's not obviously always the case. And one of the things that we often have to contend with in the beef industry is what we call failure of passive transfer, and that's when the calf, for whatever reason, doesn't get all the immunological transfer, if you will, of antibodies that occurs during that initial nursing or series of nursings, where it's that very first milk that the cow or heifer produces. It's very rich in antibody, as well as a lot of other substances that are critical for ensuring calf health. But on the beef side, we sort of assume that if we see a calf nurse, that we assume that it's getting everything that it needs, and that may or may not be the case. There's been some interesting work that's been done looking at, even in well-managed beef herds, that up to 30% of all the calves suffers from some degree of what we call failure of passive transfer. In other words, they either didn't get the ideal quantity of colostrum, or maybe the colostrum that cow or heifer was producing didn't have adequate concentration of antibodies within that colostrum. And so we've got calves that are I'll call at risk. In other words, they didn't get all the colostrum intake that they ultimately could benefit from. And so those calves are at risk. And so we start thinking about what we're doing in the spring to try to help prepare those calves for ultimately a successful outcome, not only during the sort of the post calving phase and during the nursing calf stage, but even if we think about going to weaning and beyond, even to the feeding phase of the industry. There's been some really neat work that's been done that would suggest that those calves that didn't get all the colostrum that they, or had some degree of failure of passive transfer at birth, are at a higher risk for disease, not just during the nursing phase, but even, further down the production chain. And so we start thinking about, well, what can we do in a perfect world to help ensure survivability or trying to maintain the health of those calves and ensure that they ultimately reach their full genetic potential. And we start thinking about things like, vaccination, deworming, plus or minus whether or not we're going to implant those calves. And also this is a time to think about, doing things that may occur in a calf's life that the earlier that we can do them, the better. Well, I'm talking about castration. If the calf has horns, now is an ideal time, or not now, but when we start thinking about processing or working those calves in the spring, either spring turnout or branding time, to get, again, depending upon the region of the country that you're from and how you characterize that, but sort of that initial processing or working event in that calf's life to help, establish and set up that calf from an immune perspective to face the challenges it's going to have throughout the nursing phase, and also, down the line from a production phase standpoint, and then also ensure that we're doing some of these maybe more invasive procedures like castration and dehorning at a younger age to help minimize the stress that's associated with that.
Very good.
I'm sorry. So Corey, you asked me specifically about vaccinations, and I kind of got sidetracked there and got off onto a bit of a tangent. But so, one of the most widely used vaccines sort of in this nursing calf space or time frame, if you will, is called Inforce 3. It's an intranasal vaccine that we have at Zoetis that contains a temperature-sensitive modified live, IBR, and PI3. IBR is infectious bovine rhinotracheitis. PI3 is parainfluenza virus. And then the unique thing that with Inforce 3 is that also contains BRSV. And this vaccine was first launched in 2010, so we're getting ready to celebrate its 11th anniversary later this year of when that product was launched into the marketplace. And, it is, on average, we'll sell around 20 million doses of that vaccine a year. It's the most, in terms of cattle vaccines, there are more doses of Inforce 3 that are sold than any other cattle vaccine that's manufactured or produced. So we have a very nice track record in terms of performance and safety of Inforce 3. And one of the benefits that it has is it is able to, I spend a lot of time talking about maternal antibody and colostrum intake by those calves and ensuring that we're, getting those calves off to a good start from an immunological perspective. One of the benefits to Inforce 3 is that we're actually able to stimulate an immune response in those calves in the face of maternal antibodies. So when that calf does nurse the colostrum and does, let's assume that it does receive adequate levels of colostrum and adequate quantities of antibody transfer from that cow, that animal is going to have circulating antibodies. That calf is going to have circulating antibodies. And to really get those calves started on a good start, we need to give them a vaccine that's going to actually stimulate an immune response in the face of maternal antibody. And we've actually been able to demonstrate that with Inforce. The intranasal route actually does a really nice job of stimulating the local immune response and local immunity, and we get a really nice response to that vaccine, even in the face of maternal antibody. One of the things that, I talked about the risk of disease for these calves. So if we look at, throughout the entire beef production chain, the number one infectious disease or the number one disease process that we have to be concerned about is bovine respiratory disease. Depending on what the reference you're looking at or whomever you're listening to or whatever article that you're reading, that disease costs the industry somewhere north of $1 billion a year. But when we start thinking about, and now, obviously, the majority of that is going to occur during the post-weaning or feeding phases of the production, right? But if we start talking about nursing calves in general, there is such a thing that we often refer to as nursing calf pneumonia or summer pneumonia, okay, going back to sort of the springtime pattern of calving, if you will. Summer pneumonia can affect, again, depending upon the reference that you're looking at, somewhere around 20% of all herds experience at least one calf during the summer that will experience pneumonia. And it's hard to put a number in terms of what that costs the industry, but estimates have been suggested that just that in and of itself will be somewhere north of $200 million a year and on an annual basis to the beef industry. So it's an extremely expensive disease, costly disease, not only certainly from a animal health and productivity standpoint, but when we start thinking of things about animal well-being just in general, and trying to protect the investment that I elaborated on early, that we go to all the effort to get a cow bred, maintain that pregnancy during the entirety of gestation, and then our efforts to actually have a successful calving. It makes all the sense in the world to try to protect those young animals to the degree that we can from a disease such as bovine respiratory disease.
Very good. One of the questions that Rebecca had was at what age should they be using Inforce 3?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's actually approved and labeled for calves over 3 days of age. And many of our studies that we've conducted have been in calves at that 3 to 6 day of age stage. And certainly in instances or in herds where they have a history of nursing calf pneumonia, or have a history of these calves getting sick with respiratory disease in the first 30 to 60 days of life, that would be certainly something that you could consider. Generally speaking, what we see Inforce incorporated into a herd health program is really during that sort of initial processing or spring turnout or branding time frame, and that would be the 30 to 60 to 90 days, depending upon how the length of your actual calving season. But that's typically when we see the majority of doses that go into nursing calves, we see the majority of it go into that sort of 60 to 90 day time frame.
Okay. One other question is, what would be some of the key differences to consider between an intranasal versus an IM?
Intramuscular.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things just in general for intranasal, so they have some advantages. The first one is I've already talked on, that typically with intranasal vaccines, we tend to get a more consistent immune response in the face of maternal antibodies. So that's number one. Sometimes I'll just refer to it as a systemic vaccine or injectable vaccine, whether it's IM or sub-Q. But with a systemic vaccine, sometimes we don't get we will indeed have some antibody interference from some of those circulating antibodies that were a result of adequate colostral intake, if you will. So first and foremost, we get a nice response in the face of maternal antibody. The other things that we need to be thinking about specifically around intranasal vaccines is that they typically will have a more rapid onset of protection, if you will, or more rapid onset of stimulate immunity and more rapidly than a systemic or injectable vaccine. And that's true. And there's been some work that has been conducted that's established that. The precursor of Inforce 3 for Zoetis was a product called TSV2, and it's a temperature sensitive IBR PI3 without the BRSV. And the majority of that vaccine has been displaced by Inforce 3 when we launched it in 2010. But having said that, we did some nice work with TSV2 looking specifically at that IBR and PI3 component, and we're actually able to demonstrate some protection 48 to 72 hours after vaccine administration. So that's a pretty rapid response and a pretty rapid onset of protection, if you will, if you start thinking about some of the advantages of using an intranasal when compared to a systemic. Generally speaking, we're going to be looking at the 4, 5, 6, 7 day range before we start to develop some degree of protection from a systemic immunity or from a systemic vaccine. The other thing that's beneficial to intranasal vaccines just in general is that they, I mentioned the sort of the quicker onset, if you will, or quicker stimulation of immune response. The other thing that they will produce is a substance called interferon, which is a very non-specific sort of, and I'm taking some liberties here and maybe going to oversimplify things to help with the understanding, but it's like would be just a sort of an antiviral type substance that the body has produced. So what way to think about it is if we're infecting those cells with a vaccine virus by administering a vaccine, and we're infecting those cells with a vaccine virus, those cells that have been infected with that vaccine virus will stimulate what we call interferon, which is a very, as I said, non-specific sort of antiviral substance. So basically, that's the body's way of protecting the other cells that maybe haven't been infected. So it's a very non-specific response. The benefit of that is it occurs relatively rapidly, again, within that 48 to 72 hour time frame. But it will also decrease relatively rapidly as well. So if you look at the studies that have been, conducted to evaluate sort of an interferon response to vaccine, particularly the intranasal vaccines, we see that sort of begin to occur within the 48, 72 hour time frame, sort of peak at 6 to 7 days, and then begin to sort of taper off between days 10, 12, 14. And so it disappears, relatively rapidly as well. And that has sort of led to the dogma that intranasal vaccines are quick acting, but short acting. The beauty is with Inforce 3, we've actually done some work to demonstrate that from a duration of immunity perspective. In other words, how long does that vaccine actually last, or how long can we get protection from that vaccine? And it will depend upon which specific component of the vaccine that we're talking about, whether it's the IBR or the BRSV. But we've been able to demonstrate that we get about 6 months worth of protection from the IBR component of Inforce, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 months for the BRSV component of that vaccine. That's what we've been able to demonstrate with some of the studies. So that sort of debunks the myth, if you will, that these intranasal vaccines are sort of quick acting, but short acting. So I think we've demonstrated that just because it's an intranasal vaccine and it works quickly, that there is some duration of immunity there. The thing that really differentiates Inforce, okay, the intranasal vaccine, from other intranasal vaccines on the marketplace, because there are some, is the degree of protection that we get from BRSV. BRSV is an acronym for bovine respiratory syncytial virus. And so some of you may be familiar with respiratory syncytial virus and its impact potentially on children. Okay, it's a very similar virus, but it behaves in a similar fashion, but it's a distinctly different virus from those that obviously infects young children. But my point is, Inforce offers the highest level of protection from that BRSV virus than any other cattle vaccine in the marketplace. It actually has a label for the prevention of disease caused by BRSV, and that's a label claim that's unsurpassed by any other vaccine in the marketplace.
All right, Deborah had a question. She said, "Are there any must-dos before turning a bottle calf back to the herd?"
Is this a bottle calf that was purchased, or is this a bottle calf that, for whatever reason, the cow or the heifer didn't take?
We'll see if she replies back.
And so let me just say, the reason that I asked that is, number one, the thing that ultimately you need to ensure is that either the cow or heifer is going to accept that animal back. If it's a calf that for whatever reason was a little slow to get up, maybe the cow or heifer rejected it to begin with, and it looks like that you were able to sustain that calf for a period of a few days to maybe a week or so, and you're trying to get it regrafted, if you will, back onto the dam that it came from. That's one scenario, and so the first thing to ensure would be that has indeed occurring, okay, and that dam has accepted that calf. If it's a bottle calf that has been purchased, okay, and that you're wanting to turn in with the rest of the animals, I guess I would express a little caution there, because some of these bottle calves can carry some disease, and we start thinking about, what our goals are as a herd from a biocontainment, biosecurity perspective. I would be a little cautious about doing that. And probably the first thing that I would ensure is that calf is not persistently infected with the bovine viral diarrhea virus. Okay. Would be a very efficient way to create yourself some problems within that herd if you're purchasing bottle calves and turning them in with the rest of the herd.
Okay. Mary had a not real specific question, but was asking about your calf guard vaccine and if you like it.
Well, certainly, it's a great vaccine. It's really designed in situations where we have herds that have a history of neonatal diarrhea, and this provides an added boost to those calves. From a rota and corona perspective, two of the viruses that cause neonatal diarrhea. There are some I guess I'm not going to call them cautions, but some sort of caveats, some label indications that you need to be aware of, that ultimately, to achieve maximum protective ability with the calf guard vaccine, needs to be given before those calves begin to nurse. Okay, so that in and of itself can create some challenges for us, right? Because you almost have to be right on top of that calf to be able to establish that that's occurred. But the reason that's the case, if we go back to sort of my opening remarks around colostrum and ensuring that we have adequate colostrum intake in those calves, that if we know there's antibodies in that colostrum, and if we're administering a vaccine that's going to be given orally, and it's after that calf has already ingested colostrum, we're going to see some inactivation, if you will, or some blocking of that vaccine and its ability to actually create an immune response. Does that make sense? Some of the antibodies already in the digestive system are going to interfere with that vaccine's ability to do its job. But in situations where you're either able to do that, or in situations where you've experienced and have a history of a high degree of neonatal diarrhea or calf scours within a herd, it's sort of another step that you can take to help try to mitigate that.
Okay. Charlotte asked, what do you recommend for maintaining good gut health in new babies?
Well, the best thing that we can do for a new baby is to ensure that it gets adequate colostrum and ensure that its dam is mothering it appropriately. And that generally will take care of any gut associated issues that we're going to have as it relates to gut health. Now, so I guess the easy answer from my perspective is leave them alone. If we're ensuring, number one, that we're doing all we can to ensure adequate colostrum intake, leave them alone and let them go be a calf and a cow. But in those situations where you've got, I mentioned neonatal diarrhea or calf scours, there's some things that we need to do there to, potentially at times we need to intervene there. But the primary thing there is we're not so much considered about gut health as we are just ensuring that those calves remain hydrated, because that's ultimately the number one cause of mortality in calves that experience neonatal diarrhea is they become dehydrated, and ultimately they die of dehydration.
Okay, Ben, welcome back. He's joined us before. He had a question of if there's anything new in the Zoetis pipeline that he should be keeping an eye out for in the future.
So
Great secrets, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the things that it's kind of like the government, it's classified. So let me just say that that's one of the key things for the ultimately the overall health and I talked about health and survivability of the animals that we care for, right? But that's also related to the health and survivability of the organization, and that's one of the things. We have a very robust group of colleagues and a dedicated business unit, if you will, within Zoetis that we call VMRD. It's called Veterinary Medical research and development, and it goes across all of our species, all of our the products for all the species that ultimately that we make products for. And they do a wonderful job. I don't know if, tell me his name again. Ben. I don't know if Ben has been paying any attention to the pet care side of our business or has any pets, but over the last several years, we've had a number of really innovative launches around products that are, primarily associated with pet care. On the cattle side, we've got some products that we're very excited about, and we hope to be bringing to the marketplace in the not too distant future, but I can't provide a lot of detail beyond that.
Okay. Maybe we shift gears just a little bit here. And do you want to talk to, is there still some value in implanting your calves?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, because that's one of the things that I'm actually very passionate about, and it's and the reason I'm passionate about it is because I think there's a huge opportunity there for most cow-calf producers that is being left on the table, so to speak. So one of the things that we know about nursing calf implants, and so with Zoetis, we've got a product called Synovex C. But look, we're not unique in that regard. There are other manufacturers that will manufacture or other companies that will manufacture a nursing calf implant. The one that we have is Synovex C, and certainly the advantage of nursing calf implants just in general that you can just about set your watch to is the benefit that you're going to see from a performance perspective during the nursing phase. And I say you can set your watch to it, but if you look at the universe of studies that have been conducted evaluating nursing calf implants and the benefit that they have on production and performance of that nursing calf, it's going to be somewhere in the range of 19 to 20 pounds, right? And so if we think about the margins just in general related to the beef industry and some of the things that we can do to enhance those margins and enhance the return on investment that we're investing in ultimately the animals that we care for, implanting is one of the things that will ring the bell just about every time. So if we think about 19 or 20 pounds of gain per animal during the nursing phase, or between the time that you implant an animal, let's assuming it's at a 60 to 90 day time frame. If you implant that animal and then weigh them again at weaning time, you would see about a 19 to 20 pound increase above those animals that are not implanted. And you start doing a return on investment calculation, and assuming that a nursing calf implant or Synovex C is $1.25 or somewhere in that time frame or range. And look, I'm not going to sit here and go through the pricing structure because that's I'll be out over my skis if I start doing that. But if we look at things that actually can improve the productivity of the herd and actually have a return on investment, some of the practices that we do, I spend a lot of time talking about vaccinating these young calves and things that we can do to help ensure health. If you implant those animals, that's basically going to allow you to pay for all that, plus some. Okay, so that's one of the things that, again, I'm extremely passionate about. And if you look at the number of calves that are implanted across the industry in the U.S., it's only in a neighborhood of 20 to 30% of all nursing calves are implanted. So my point, and that number, by the way, is trending down. I think for a number of reasons, but my point is there's a huge opportunity there, and I think a lot of producers are leaving money on the table by not implanting their calves. I mean, some of the obstacles or I'll guess call it arguments that we experience when we talk to producers about implanting nursing calves as well. It's the labor involved, or maybe it's been so long since I've done it, I don't want to have to relearn how to do that. And really, in reality, it's not a difficult process. And if you're going to be, vaccinating those calves anyway, it would seem to reason, at least to me, that you should, take the extra effort and go ahead and implant those animals at the same time. there's obviously each one of the implants that you have will have a specific implanting device or an implant gun, what we call it, that is, specific to the implant that you're using. And there's some, I understand that there may be some, again, some inconvenience there that you just can't have one implant device and use a multitude of implants. But there's really, really no good reason not to be implanting calves unless you're enrolled in a specific program, all right, that is going to be paying you a premium to deliver a calf that has not been implanted. Okay, so unless you're enrolled in a specific program or something like that that's going to be giving you a premium to do that, you're leaving money on the table. And in certain instances, even if you are receiving a premium, you're still leaving money on the table when you start looking at the performance that you're going to get by implanting those calves. I lost my train of thought there. One of the other obstacle or sort of arguments that we'll receive as it relates to implanting calves is that there is a perception there that an implanted calf will be discounted when they're sold. And that may or may not be the case depending upon where you're at, but there's been some really nice work looking at, Superior Livestock, and the listeners on this particular webinar may or may not be familiar with Superior Livestock, but it's a large video auction. And one of my former colleagues at Zoetis conducted a study several years ago and authored a paper that looked at implanted calves versus non-implanted calves and the difference in price sold through like a 5-year period during as part of this Superior Livestock auction database. And again, I'm not necessarily promoting Superior Livestock. Please don't get me wrong, because I know there's a lot of folks probably on the webinar that are going to use their local sale barn, and that's completely fine. But my point is, in most instances, there certainly is not a discount associated with implanting and how those calves are sold. Another argument that we'll often get is there's a concern, okay, going along with sort of the discount, there's a concern that if those calves are implanted during the nursing calf phase, that they won't perform as well during the stocker or feeding phase of the production chain. And there's been, again, some really nice work, some really nice studies that have been conducted. Several of those studies have actually been conducted just north of y'all in Nebraska, University of Nebraska, looking at if those calves are implanted during the nursing phase and even again during the stocker phase, there's no detrimental impact during the feeding phase. So in other words, those calves that do not get an implant don't experience any sort of compensatory gain during the feeding phase. There's actually been some very nice work that would very clearly demonstrate that.
Okay.
Ben said he has been keeping up with your company and to keep up the great work.
Oh, well, thank you. Appreciate the support as a customer.
And Susan echoed the same as Ben as well. Mary had a question about deworming and was curious if she should be deworming by pounds or by age.
Yeah, so great question. And without question, you should be deworming by pounds. And I will take that a step further. And if you're deworming a group of animals, right, and if you're not going to adjust the dose based upon the individual animal weight, because obviously there's going to be some variation. And if you're deworming a number of animals at the same time, it's pretty easy to use an automatic syringe or something that's going to be giving a consistent dose time after time. But my caution there would be to make sure that you adjust that dose to accommodate the largest animal that you may potentially be deworming. Oftentimes you'll see people adjust to the average. Well, the calves are on average going to weigh 300 pounds, so I'll, adjust my syringe to 300 pounds and go on. Well, certainly for the ones that are less than 300 pounds, that's going to be adequate. And for those that are at 300 pounds, that's going to be adequate. But those that are going to weigh 3.5 or 4, you're essentially underdosing those. So absolutely, it's the label would indicate that there's a very clear label indication on Dectamax, both the injectable and the poron, for dose per pound of body weight. per 100 pounds.
Okay. That's all the questions that we're seeing right now. Is there, I guess we'll kind of do a last call for any questions, and Rick or Dr. Blanding, if there's anything else that we haven't hit on that you think would be valuable for our watchers to hear, that would be great to add, a great time to add too.
Let me also elaborate just a little bit on that question now that I give it some additional consideration. And I really appreciate the question about calves, because when we start thinking about, particularly, again, going back to sort of our theme of springtime, animal health, or approach to our springtime animal health program, if you will. When people are usually considering deworming, they're talking about the adult animals, okay, the cows and the bulls, right? And deworming those animals, and that's critically important. But it's often the question that we often get is it even any value to deworm the calves at all? So sort of in contrast to the previous question where they're wanting to know, do I deworm the calf based upon his age or its weight? I just want to reinforce that it's also important to deworm, in addition to the adult animals, to also deworm the calves. And so the benefits there is, number one, you're going to get a performance advantage. And I talked about the return on investment from an implant. The return on investment from deworming is very, very similar. Okay, so you're going to very consistently get a performance benefit from deworming those young animals. The other thing to keep in mind with a young animal is that because as animals become exposed to parasites, and at any given time, all right, people think about the parasites that are in the animal, but really in any given time, there's if you look at the universe of parasites, 90% of the parasites are going to be on pasture in the grass, and only 10% are going to be in the animal. Now, those parasites are going to be at different developmental stages. Okay, those that are on the grass and the pasture are in a different developmental stage than those that are in the animal. Okay, the larvae are microscopic worms that are out on pasture, and those are sort of the very early stages of these. Let me back up just a bit. I hope I'm not going to take too much time here, but when we have an animal that is parasitized, the adult parasites in that animal, the females will produce eggs. Okay, the eggs are then shed out into the lumen of the digestive tract, and then they are passed in the feces out on pasture. Well, those eggs will continue to mature, and then ultimately, if conditions are right, those eggs will then, for lack of a better term, hatch, and these infective larvae will then emerge from those eggs, and they'll sort of migrate out away from the, for lack of a better term, the dung patty, if you will, the manure patty, and will sort of hang out in the grass. And that's where they are then consumed by other animals. Well, and the cycle will then repeat itself, and ultimately those infective larvae will be consumed by animals, and then they'll find their way into the digestive tract, attached to the digestive tract, and begin to mature and develop, and ultimately turn into adults and repeat the cycle. But what we're trying to accomplish is a couple of things to keep in mind, going back to my theme of deworming the calf. Calves tend to be very susceptible to parasites, just in general, because as animals age and mature, they develop some degree of inherent resistance to parasites, or inherent immunity to parasites, that will help limit those parasites' ability to, those animals will still become infected, but will limit the parasite's ability to mature and lay eggs, all right? But the young animals don't have that sort of inherent immunity yet, and so they may become actually more susceptible to infection, and actually may become more heavily parasitized than an adult animal. And so we start thinking about that life cycle of having an adult parasite in an infected animal laying eggs. Actually, the calves are more prolific. The parasites in the calves are more prolific egg layers, than the parasites that are going to be infecting an older or more mature animal, if that makes sense. Now, in terms of volume, right, of eggs that are going to be shed out into the pasture, it's going to be less in those calves, just because they don't have people didn't tune in to hear about volume of manure, but a cow is going to produce a higher volume, or an adult animal is going to produce a higher volume of manure than a calf will, but actually the calf manure will be have a higher concentration of eggs and potentially infective larvae once they hatch than a mature animal. So that was a long dissertation on sort of the basics of parasitology in calves. But my point is, don't ignore the calf when it comes time to deworming, and you're visiting with your veterinarian about deworming strategies for the spring. It's important to keep in mind about deworming that calf as well.
All right, Riva had a question. If you use Dectamax injectable, should you also use a paste or poron at the same time?
That's a great question. And if I'm assuming, based upon our theme here, we're talking about cows and calves. And so the short answer is no, not really. And the reason being is you've probably heard of parasiticide or anthelmintic or dewormer rotation. And that can be, in certain situations, a valid strategy to help mitigate the impact of, and I don't want to get too deep here because it gets to be pretty complex, but we are seeing an emergence, if you will, of resistance to anthelmintics with among parasites in the U.S. Okay, certainly for those that are maybe listening that have goats or sheep, small ruminants, they are well aware of this sort of emergence of resistance, if you will, to anthelmintics or dewormers amongst the parasites that infect the small ruminants. Certainly, we're not seeing that in the same degree with cattle, but it's certainly something that's on our horizon. And anthelmintic rotation, if you will, can be a strategy to help mitigate that. But by and large, I wouldn't, in most cow-calf situations, let's call it the concurrent or the combination use of an injectable or a poron dewormer along with an oral. I wouldn't, and nor is a recommendation amongst parasitologists at this point to apply something like that at the cow-calf segment of our industry. We are starting to see some of that in other segments, but certainly it's not something that should be considered the cow-calf segment. And that's also something that is considered to be extra labeled use of those products, and it's something that certainly needs to be discussed with your veterinarian.
Okay.
The short answer to that question is no.
Well, that's all really good information. And it sounds like she's been working with her vet on the Dectomax injectable side and was just looking to see if she should be doing more. So that's good information for her. Go ahead.
I was just going to also say, let me also expand on that a little bit. I'm somewhat relieved, but also encouraged to hear her say Dectomax injectable. And often the question we get is, should I use an injectable or a poron? And really the rationale there is, at least from my perspective, is, what are we really trying to accomplish? And I sort of say that tongue in cheek, but one of the things that we do know is that the injectable dewormers are more effective than the poron dewormers are. And it's the same is true with Dectamax. Both products are Zoetis products, and we sell them both, obviously. But if somebody asks me if they're more concerned about controlling internal parasites, without question and without hesitation, I tell them to use the injectable, because we get more consistent application, obviously more consistent absorption. And oftentimes when something is sold with convenience in mind, there's usually sort of more opportunity to get lazy with something like that. And I can tell you that typically with the poron products, we see more variability in absorption, more variability in application, just more variability in general. And so whenever possible, choose the injectable when compared to the poron.
Great. We have one that we'll bounce back to that Danny had asked about Bovishield Gold and if one shot is as effective as the regular Bovishield Gold. And she's referencing the one shot type versus the regular.
So is the question, is Bovishield Gold one shot as effective as giving Bovishield plus one shot separately? Is that the way I should understand the question?
I'm not sure.
Let me see. This is.
Well, so let me just provide a little more detail around Bovishield Gold one shot. So Bovishield Gold one shot is a combination of Bovishield Gold 5, which would be IBR, PI3, BRSV again, as well as BVD types 1 and 2. So that's where the 5 with Bovishield Gold 5 comes from. The one shot is actually an incorporation of the Mannheim hemolytica vaccine that we have. And so it's an incorporation of both those vaccines together, and it can be given in one dose or one shot, excuse me. That's the combination Bovishield Gold one shot. That product was launched in 2012, 2011, 2012, that time frame, and I may not be exactly correct on that because it's been a little while since I went back and checked on that. But prior to that, we had Bovishield Gold 5 as one vaccine and one shot as another. And so folks would have to give essentially 2 injections to an animal. This, going back to my point around convenience, and this would be sort of in contrast to my comments around convenience previously, the combination of Bovishield Gold one shot is just as effective, if not more so, than giving Bovishield separately and one shot separately. And part of that is around some of the enhancements and improvements we made to the one shot fraction of that, the Mannheim hemolytic fraction, which I talked a lot about respiratory disease earlier. Mannheim hemolytic is the #1 bacterial organism that causes pneumonia in cattle or bovine respiratory disease. And so combining those made a lot of sense, and it actually enhanced the convenience, if you will, by doing that. But it also provides very strong protection both from a viral aspect as well as from the Mannheim hemolytica aspect.
Okay. I think that answers your question. Danny, let us know if there was something more to that. I think what you just had about wondering if one shot is as good as the regular Bovishield that requires 2.
Yeah. So in this particular case, opt for the convenience.
Okay. Very good. Well, without further ado, I think that's all of our questions. So why don't we go ahead and pick our gift card winners for the day?
So we're going to pick 3 winners, and they're each going to get a $50 gift card. So our first winner is Pebbles Tina Rigsby. And our second winner is Barb Lang.
Congrats, Barb.
And our third winner is Deborah Lash Maxon.
All right, very good. Congratulations, everybody.
If you heard your name, go ahead and send us a PM to claim your prize. So we want to thank you guys so much for joining us today as well.
And thank you, Dr. Blanding. That was tons of great information. And Rick, as always, we appreciate your support.
Before we get off of here, we have one thing. We have our Swinging for the Fences sweepstakes going on. It just started yesterday, so this is a new one. So get entered now. You have until April 23rd, and we will go over some of the prize packages on Thursday.
So very good. And if you have any other questions come through, just let us know, and we'll be sure to either get back with you or we'll get in touch with Dr. Blanding and Rick and get some answers for you that way as well. So thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you again soon.
Have a good evening, guys.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Melanie and Corey, thank you.